Hello, Commander, and welcome to GameSpot's three-part series on XCOM 2. Last month at PAX, GameSpot got to spend some time with lead designer Jake Solomon to talk about the history of the franchise, its 2012 rebirth, and his plans for XCOM 2.
Thanks, mysterious stranger. I'll pick it up from here. Over the next 3 days, we're going to explore all these avenues, but today we focus on the past. I've played every XCOM, at least the ones that have been released, and though you may be familiar with the original game, you might not realize that this is a franchise that's been kicked about more than a can in a prison yard. It's had some wonderful games and some appallingly terrible ones.
So let's dive into it, Commander. Today on Part 1, the history of XCOM.
The seeds of XCOM were sown in Laser Squad, released on various home computers in 1988. Designed by British programmer Julian Gollop, this turn-based wargame had you take on a series of missions, ranging from rescue missions to assassinations and firefights. It was well received, and later that year, Julian and his brother Nick started their own development studio, Mythos Games. And coming off the success of Laser Squad, they once again turned to turn-based strategy. At first they wanted to release a sequel to Laser Squad, but the game's publisher, Baltimore-based Microprose, wanted something fresh. Mythos' first real game was released in 1994, and it's fair to say that XCOM was an instant classic. UFO Enemy Unknown, or XCOM UFO Defense as it was titled in North America, is a strategy game in which you manage an organization responsible for protecting the human race from an extraterrestrial threat. It's sort of two games mashed together. The first, a base management simulator that has you building bases, buying interceptor ships, conducting research, and lobbying for funds from the various world powers. From here you decide what threats to investigate and which UFOs to shoot down, and once you've downed a UFO and equipped your response team, the game swaps into a turn-based strategy game. This is where the bulk of your time with XCOM will be spent. The game is turn-based, meaning that you and the aliens take turns in moving, and these movements are limited by a set number of action points. Every action you take costs points: moving, shooting, reloading, crouching, even priming grenades. So you have to be careful to ensure you're spending your AP wisely. It plays like a game of chess, where every move is as much about creating offensive opportunities as it is ensuring your pieces are safe from opposition attack. Once you've made your moves, the game swaps control to the aliens, and you have to watch as the aliens scutter about in the darkness, emerging to take pop shots at your fragile troopers and reacting to your tactics. XCOM was also incredibly atmospheric. Distant alien noises and human screams coupled with creepy music and the ominous fog of war meant that even stepping out of your ship required bravery. Soldiers could be killed in an instant. Doing so often caused new recruits to freak the hell out and flee and shoot wildly. Tactical advantages could be flipped in an instant, meaning you never really felt like you were in full control. I asked Jake what it was about the first game that made it so memorable.
So the original XCOM, I got that when I was a senior in high school, and I played that obsessively. And if you played it, you know, I have so many memories of sitting there alone at night. It's a very spooky game, you know, and so I just have many of these memories, just me sitting in front of the computer. Greg and I, my art director and I, we went and looked back at it recently, and it's, you know, it's like 340 by 260 or 3, and you're like, how did that work? Like, how was I so terrified? But you read so much into it, you know? It was very hard to understand, like, and so it was like you didn't know why things were happening. It felt like a real simulation. I think that's what it was, is when you play it, it feels like a simulation more than probably any strategy game today. That, you know, the game sort of felt like it was its own little world running. So yeah, and it was spooky, and it was, you know, awesome. You get attached to your soldiers, you know. It's always been my favorite game.
XCOM was tough and complex. It was a game that mirrored real-life combat, harsh, demanding, and ambivalent to your struggles. It was also beloved by gamers, and they weren't the only ones who wanted more. Microprose asked the Gollops to do it again in under 6 months. But Mythos decided to pass and jump onto the third game in the series, Apocalypse, so the responsibility to make the 6-month sequel landed on a UK studio run by Microprose. It took them 12 months to complete it, but complete it they did, in exactly the type of fashion you'd expect. They took the old game and stuck on some new textures. XCOM Terror from the Deep was set decades after the first game, where you fight a recently awoken alien race who crashed into the Earth 65 million years prior, killing all the dinosaurs. Quite why you have to fight them underwater is never really explained, but as all the alien equipment you researched in the previous games doesn't work in salt water, it proves as a handy plot device. Also, when you end the game, you accidentally plunge the Earth into an apocalypse. Terror from the Deep wasn't much of a revolution from the first game, but it was still fun. It was harder and generally considered a rather tired sequel to a wonderful game.
XCOM to me, UFO Defense, I suppose in Europe it was Enemy Unknown, that's right. But to me that was the game that resonated with me the most because it was set on Earth, and Terror from the Deep is under the water, but you could look at XCOM and you could say, okay, I reckon that's a field, that's a farm. I had this emotional connection to all this stuff. Oh, I'm in a city now. And so then when they went under the water, one, the game was really difficult. Terror from the Deep was really difficult. But it was interesting how once it went under the water and all these crazy aliens, then I just didn't feel as strong of a connection to the places. And so, and Apocalypse was awesome. You know, it was awesome, but it was really sci-fi. That game was really sci-fi.
While Terror from the Deep was being made out of house, Mythos were working on the third game, Apocalypse. This was set a century after the end of the second game, as humanity has been forced to settle into megacities to escape the global meltdown of the planet's ecosystem. Released in 1997, it was quite a departure from the main series, featuring new graphics, interface, and adaptive enemy AI, and even allowed you to play the game in real time or in the traditional turn-based mode. After Apocalypse's release, however, Mythos were worried that they'd lose the lawsuit if they tried to retain the IP in court, so they struck a licensing deal for Apocalypse and handed over the XCOM license to Microprose.
If you talk about any others past that, I don't have that much experience. Talking about Interceptor, Enforcer, no, I don't.
I suppose I should explain. You were so close to being complete. And though you've yet to undergo a full subsystem stress test,
Jake draws a blank here for a good reason. The next decade of XCOM games has almost been lost to history, but it contains a bunch of games, terrible review scores, and an IP being bounced from company to company. The first game, XCOM Interceptor, made by Microprose now that they own the IP, was released in 1998. It was a flight sim mixed with the usual base management stuff. Set before Apocalypse, it had a completely different tone to the original three games, with loads of bizarre pop culture references, and full of the type of humour your embarrassing uncle would make over Thanksgiving dinner. After the release of Interceptor, Hasbro, the toy makers, bought the struggling Microprose, in turn taking over the XCOM brand with an eye to assimilating it into its various toy ranges. Hasbro Interactive's first attempt at this was 1999's XCOM First Alien Invasion, a play-by-mail multiplayer game. Now, if you've never heard of play-by-mail multiplayer, it's essentially the email equivalent of playing a game of chess over the mail. And if that wasn't bad enough, Hasbro wasn't done yet. Soon afterwards, the struggling company cancelled two XCOM games they had adopted in the Microprose takeover: Alliance, a first-person shooter, and Genesis, a strategy game set in a world familiar to fans of the original game. Neither was close enough to complete, and financial trouble meant that Hasbro needed to sell something quick. So they took assets from both games and then cobbled them together to make 2001's XCOM Enforcer, a by-the-numbers third-person shooter with barely a thematic or tonal link to the original games. I played a bunch of it a couple of years ago, and it's, man, just take a look yourself.
The alien invaders draw nearer with every nanosecond. Time is fleeting, Enforcer. Finish charging up, get out there, and do what you were made to do. Eradicate those aliens.
Soon afterwards, the assets of Hasbro Interactive were sold to French developer Infogrames, and XCOM became stuck in a game of IP tennis for a couple of years. In 2004, Infogrames, now rebranded Atari, sold the rights to the Civilization franchise to Take-Two Interactive. The struggling company then sold back the digital rights to a bunch of Hasbro properties the following year, Transformers and My Little Pony. And that same year, in June of 2005, Take-Two Interactive bought a bunch more IPs from Atari, one of them being XCOM. Take-Two went right to work on their IP. In April 2010, 2K Marin, developers of Bioshock 2, announced that they were working on a new XCOM, and a month later at E3, we saw it. The game, entitled XCOM, was a first-person shooter set in the 50s where, at least according to the trailer, you used a variety of weapons to kill a bunch of weird black goo. Sadly for 2K, the trailer was not well received by fans of the series, who were pining for a classic XCOM game, but little did they know, one was already in development. You see, in 2005, the same year Take-Two had acquired the XCOM license, a year after they had acquired the Civilizations license, they had also acquired Firaxis Games, the studio set up by former Microprose developers Sid Meier, Jeff Briggs, and Brian Reynolds, who had left the company to release some of the best strategy games of all time, Alpha Centauri and Civilization. The stage was set for the ultimate comeback. While 2K Marin's XCOM game would change into a third-person shooter, the Bureau XCOM Declassified came out in August 2013, behind closed doors the keys to a classic XCOM were being handed to a young designer and a lifelong fan of the series. His name is Jake, and we're going to talk to him about it tomorrow.
And that's where we leave today's story. Make sure you check back tomorrow to see how Jake and his team at Firaxis took a series that had been kicked from pillar to post and gave it the rebirth it deserved. See you then, Commander.